So we've got a lot of material that I want to cover this weekend with us, and so I'm going to dive right in. So I'm just going to let you know right up front, I don't have a funny story for you. We're going right in the Bible, okay? That's as funny as I get this evening, because we actually have some dots to connect that might be a little challenging for some of us. So I want to give you some context before we even start reading the passage that we're about to get into, okay? So Genesis, if you look at the story of Genesis, there's this pivotal moment kind of early in the pages that if you look at Genesis, the entirety of it, you've got chapters 1 through 11, and they kind of give us a really big picture. They paint a big picture for us that really show us kind of our origins, and they show us why we struggle with brokenness. So it describes where we came from and what sin is about. And then there's this moment where God zooms in, and he stops kind of talking about humanity in general, and he zooms in on a very particular family. And this family, they're desert dwellers, and they land in an area called Haran. And in this family, there's a man named Abram. Abram lives in this place, Haran, for about 75 years before we meet him here in Genesis chapter 12. And then God begins to speak, and as we've seen through this series, when he begins to speak, a lot of things happen. A lot of good things, a lot of big things begin to happen. And so I want you to hear what he speaks to Abram. He says, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and to him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So you'll notice here that this passage, it's simultaneously about Abram and not about Abram, because he's involved in it. But if you noticed it, it's all about God, because he's the one who's saying, I will do this. I will do this. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will give you a great name. I will protect you. I will guide you. He's saying all those things kind of packaged in here. He says, I will bless you, and I will bless all the families of the earth through you. And that's a projection forward, looking to that rescuer, looking to Jesus, because Jesus comes out of the lineage of Abram. And so God gives him these promises that I will do these things for you. And God has this great plan, but it all really pivots on the response here, right? It pivots on how he responds. So put yourself in his shoes here for a moment. He's lived in the same place for 75 years. And as far as we know from the Bible, he's lived a pretty uneventful life, right? He's just kind of taken care of his livestock and his family. He's lived there for 75 years. And now God is calling him away from all that. He's saying, I want you to leave behind your family. I want you to leave behind the town, the village, the area that you have known for the past 75 years. Would you be able to go? That's a really tough call, right? That's a really tough thing for him to wrestle through. And God doesn't even give him all the details here. You'll notice he doesn't even tell him where they're going to go. He just says, I will show you. He gives him a little piece of that puzzle. So you think you'd start packing your stuff? Right? This would be something that we would wrestle with, right? So we have to admire that Abram, he does an amazing thing here. But really what we're seeing in this part of the story is less about Abram, and it's more about God. And it's the fact that God is a God of promises. This is a thread that we started to see in Eden. If you'll remember to a few weeks back ago, even during the fall of mankind, God promises them a rescuer. And so God begins to lay out promises. In fact, the land that he eventually takes Abram to, we commonly refer to as the promised land, right? It's a common phrase that we use even today for certain things. And so the promised land becomes the focus of this part of the Bible. In fact, when you go through the Bible, it's saturated with this idea of promises. I did a little research and digging over the last couple of weeks. There are nearly 9,000 promises in the Bible. 7,500 of those are from God to humanity. It is saturated in these pages, promises. In fact, if you ever want something to study, that's a really good thing that will just breathe so much hope and so much life into your faith. You can go into the pages and see how God promises things to us. And there's a moment many, many years later, so we're going to fast forward a little bit, in the book of Joshua, where Israel has been kind of struggling for a bit, and then God eventually allows them to overtake this land, this promised land, after their time in Egypt, and God recaps something for them. And I think that this is important for us to all hear in regards to his promises. He says this in Joshua 21, he says, Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers. So he's pointing back to Abram. He's pointing back to these fathers. He's saying, I gave all the land that I promised to you. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Again, he's pointing back to an old promise. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. And so not one word of his good promises failed. Everything he promised to Abram and everybody he promised other things to, they all came to pass. Everything he said he would do, he did. And so we can actually amend that first statement. And not only is God a God of promises, but he's a God of reliable promises, meaning that what he promises will come true. And he has proven that time and time again. So think about this for a moment. What does it take for someone's promises to be reliable in your eyes? What does it take for that? Well, it probably takes trust, right? You need to trust this person. So let me just give you a little bit of a scenario. Let's say that your friend calls you up. This is a really good friend. You know them really well. You have a lot of shared history. And they call you up and they say, hey, I've got something really important to do on Saturday, but my car broke down. Can I borrow your car? You would probably, based on history, based on your past interactions, you would probably lend that person your car, right? It depends on whether they're a good driver or not, but you'd probably do it if it's a friend. Flip side of that coin, let's say a stranger just approaches you in the parking lot at the grocery store and says, hey, listen, my car broke down. Can I borrow yours? Are you lending the keys over? No. Why? Because shared history matters, right? And integrity matters. Those things matter when it comes to promises. And that's the thing, is that the reliability of a promise, it hinges on the promise giver, doesn't it? So whoever is giving that promise, that's what makes that promise reliable. And that's what we see here in the scriptures with God, that he is giving promises, but he is proving himself over and over again to be reliable when he gives these promises. So shared history matters and integrity matters. And that puts us in such a privileged position, because if you think about Abram and where he was, we don't know if God ever spoke to him before. As far as we know, this is the first time that God spoke. We don't know how he spoke, but he spoke to Abram, and Abram had to give a lot of trust and get up and pack up his stuff and pack up his family and head out. But for us, we're in a totally different position, because we have God's word. We have these words, these beautiful words that he has revealed to us that show that his promises come true. And we've got thousands of years of church history to see how he has worked in and been involved in and brought these promises to fruition. And for many of us, we've got examples in our own lives of where God promises something in his word and we watch it come true in our own life. So this is something that we're in a privileged position compared to Abram, because we have so much history and we have so much overlap with what God has been doing throughout the ages. So take, for example, in the word, when God promises this rescuer, that's back in Genesis 3. Well, he doesn't just stop there. What he does is he continues to promise, and he continues to narrow in on that promise. So for example, when it comes to Jesus, there are details in the Old Testament that predicted and prophesied and promised that when he would come, how he would be born, where he would be born, that he'd be born into Israel, but Israel would reject him, that he would speak in parables. There's so many details in there about those things in his life. And then with his death, there are so many of these prophecies and these promises as well, that we know down to the details of, like, when he would die, that he would be buried in a rich man's borrowed tomb. And so God makes these promises, and every time we see them, they come true. So God's promises are reliable because he has proven himself to be reliable. Now, the reliability of God's promises are a needed thing in Abram's life. They play an important role, because we have to remember that this guy, Abram, he's just a normal guy. He's a normal person like you or me. And there are times when, even though he does take that call, he does get up, he does pack up his stuff, and he does go, there are still times where he strays off the path and he departs from what God wants him to do. So yeah, we should admire him for his boldness, because that's a big move, but we have to remember that there are times where he went off course. And so I want to kind of take us down this little bit of a rabbit trail of what happens when Abram goes off course, and then I'm going to bring us back around to promises, okay? I promise. I will bring you back to promises. All right. Dad joke for you. Okay, so here's where we're going. this is just a few verses later after God gives him all these great I wills. These are what I'm going to do for you. And then notice what happens. It says, now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. So God said, Abram, I want you to go from your family, from your land. I want you to go this way. And just a few verses later, we see him going this way. He starts to depart. Well, why does he do it? This might be kind of maybe a little close to home, a little familiar example, but we notice him. He lets his circumstances determine his direction. He sees what's going on, and so he changes direction based on all the things that are happening around him. He doesn't consult God, he just changes direction. So he lets his circumstances determine his direction. He loses faith in God's promise. See, God told him to go this way, and when things got difficult or changed a bit, then Abram started to go a different way. And he took control of the situation. That was kind of his downward spiral. Do you ever let circumstances determine your direction like that? Like, has that ever backfired on you? Because when we look at Abram's story, this is what's the thread that kind of continues through his story. When we look at his story, we see it backfire, but maybe not in the way we would think. So let's continue to read his story here. So if we go to verse 11, it says, when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a woman, beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. So say you're my sister, that it will go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep and oxen and male donkeys and male servants and female donkeys and camels. So what we see here is a moment when Abram uses his wife as a pawn to save his own skin. He lies to Pharaoh, he uses Sarai, and it all worked until it didn't. Because we know a little later on in the story, Pharaoh finds out, and Pharaoh gets angry. And this is a moment of grace because Pharaoh could have killed them both right there. But God's involved in these details. And he sends them away, rather, and so Abram is able to leave with all this livestock and everything he inherited. So why did that happen? Well, it's because God's promises are bigger than our sin. Right? This was not going to derail what God had planned. His promises are way bigger than anything that we can do, any sin that we can commit. Now, Abram's going to have some consequences, absolutely, but it's not going to derail God's promises. So you would think right here, so this is a really humbling lesson for Abram, right? I took control, I went a different direction, I lied about what was going on, I used my wife for this thing, and so you would think he's humbled, he was found out. You would think he learned his lesson. But as we continue to turn the pages, we see he doesn't learn a lesson. Because there's a little while later where Abram and Sarai, they're talking together and they're realizing, hey, God promised us a nation full of children, and we're old. And we don't even have one child. And so what do? They take control again. And they think, well, maybe God's promises just need a little push from me. Have you ever been there before? He's not doing it fast enough, so I'm just going to give him a little nudge. So what does Sarai do? She comes up with a brilliant plan. She says, I'm going to get my servant, and you can have a child with her. And so she brings in Hagar, and Hagar and Abram have a child, but it doesn't solve anything. In fact, it causes more problems. Because then Sarai gets really jealous, and she starts to mistreat Hagar and her son. And they eventually end up running away. And it's just such a mess in the story of Abram and Sarai and Hagar. It's such a mess. And so you would think he would learn his lesson. But he doesn't. He keeps going. Right? So even in this mess, God is faithful to this family because his promise is even bigger than the family. It's bigger than their sin, but it's even bigger than this family because he's got a big thing coming. He has a plan. And so he reiterates this promise to them to try to remind them that you will have a son, not in the way that you want to try to orchestrate it and make it happen, but you will have a son. The two of you will have a son. And so now you would think that they would stop taking control, but they don't. A little while later, Abram and Sarai, they get new names. They change their names to, or God changes their names to Abraham and Sarah to better reflect this promise of what he's going to bring to fruition in their lives and he's going to fulfill through them. So a new situation comes up, and I want to walk us through this. This is in Genesis 20, so just a few chapters later. It says, from there, so they were on a journey, Abraham journeyed towards the territory of the Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned to Gerar. And Abraham said to his wife Sarah, she's my sister, or said of his wife Sarah, she's my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And then Abimelech, he eventually finds out what's happening, and this is what it says. Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you, dwell in it wherever it pleases you. I'm not rereading the same story, folks. He did it again. He tried to sell off his wife twice. See, he didn't learn his lesson. He has a different name, but he still has the same sin. He still has the same struggle. You see a pattern that's happening here in his life? There's a pattern of taking control away from God, of using other people for his own safety and security, and then lying about it. Taking control, using other people, and lying about it. You see this pattern in Abram's life. And this is not the kind of resume that you would think about somebody that's so revered in the Bible and as we call a father of the faith, but that's what we see in his life. And he has these flaws, and these flaws, they're not dealt with. They're not dealt with in his life, and they begin to form a pattern. And whether we admit it or not, we all have patterns like this. That if we really dig down deep inside of us, we all have patterns to our lives. For some of us, they could be really good patterns. For some of us, they could be bad. You could have a pattern of anger or addiction or lying. You could have a pattern that's healthy, like rest or exercise or thankfulness. We all have patterns to our lives. Now, neurobiology, I'm going to get nerdy for you here for a second, okay? Neurobiology, it shows that once a pattern is in your life, that's really hard to get rid of. Why? Because you've got these two connections that are happening, and dopamine, this chemical in your brain, is connecting these two things together, and it almost, as you reinforce it, creates like a roadway in your brain. And here's what they know, is that our brains are lazy. And so if we have a way of coping with something, we will go to the most immediate way to cope with something. And so if it's a bad pattern, if it's a bad habit, we'll go there. If it's a healthy one, we'll go there. But what scientists know is that our brains are lazy, and we will always go to the path of least resistance. And so patterns get formed in all of us. So do you ever get stressed at work? What is the way that you cope with that? Do you go to your pattern of eating to relieve stress? Maybe not intentionally, but it's just something that you're starting to notice. Or have you ever had a critique about something that you don't agree with? Maybe yours is denial or it's anger. Or maybe you get upset about a goal that you didn't meet, and you actually have a healthy pattern to this, and so you take a run to kind of relieve some of that stress. See, we all have patterns in our lives. And there's this other branch of science, I told you I was getting nerdy, called epigenetics. Now, we know what genetics are from school, right? That your genes are passed on from your parents, and so you've got probably blue eyes because your parents had blue eyes, or you have dark skin because your parents had dark skin, or you're tall because your parents were tall. We all know that that's passed on, but this branch of epigenetics, what it's actually showing us is not only do we get our genes passed on, but we get extra chemicals that are passed on to tell how our genes function. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. There was a study done of Holocaust survivors where you had two siblings, one that went to a concentration camp and one that didn't. And they followed the lineage of those two siblings, and they noticed that the folks who went through concentration camps and survived, they had a certain stress chemical in their blood that they could trace to their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids. They had traces of this chemical in their bodies, which shows that trauma is being passed down almost genetically inside of us. Is that not blowing your mind? That's blowing my mind, right? That science is confirming something that we see in the Bible, that sin can be passed down, that trauma can be passed down, that things can be passed on from one generation to the other if it's not dealt with, if it's not managed, if it's not brought into the light in some way. And we see that in the scriptures. We see that written in the Bible long, long ago, that sin is not an individual experience. That's why what Adam and Eve did is now inside of us. It's not just a genetic thing, a biological thing. Things get passed on to us. And so you may have inherited certain physical traits from your family, but you also inherit certain spiritual things and struggles from your family as well. And this is what we see in the life and the family of Abram. He and Sarah, they finally have their son. They have Isaac. Isaac grows up. He gets married. God promises some things to him. He begins to follow God. And then I want you to notice what happens in Isaac's life. This is Genesis 26. It says, so Isaac settled in Gerar, and when the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, she's my sister. For he feared to say, she's my wife, thinking lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. Right? You guys see it. I mean, taking control, using his wife, lying about it. It's the same pattern. It's literally the same story. It's the same king in the same town. There's a pattern here. They go on to have kids. They have Jacob and Esau. You've probably heard about them before, right? And the pattern doesn't stop. Isaac and Rebekah, they have these twins. Esau is the oldest. He is the rightful heir to the family. But what happens? You see what Jacob does if you read through the Bible. He takes control. He uses his brother. He lies about things to gain the birthright from his brother. So the pattern continues. Those guys grow up. Jacob, he has kids. He actually has 4 wives. And among all those kids, he has 12 sons. That's where we get the 12 tribes of Israel. And among those 12 sons, they don't really get along really well. In fact, they really don't like the little one. And so what do? Some of them get together and they conspire and they decide to sell their little brother into slavery and bring back his robe and lie about it to their father. Taking control, using other people, lying about it. You see the pattern that's in this family? It's not to knock them down, but it's just to show that patterns of sin exist. If we don't deal with patterns that are in our families, they get passed on to other generations. And so I just have to pause there and say, the reason why I bring all this up is not to shame. It's not so you can sit here and look back and be like, my parents were messed up. Because if you're a parent, you're also messed up. And so am I. It's not to shame. It's not to look back at previous generations and say, they're the way that I am, and give any kind of shame. But it's just to acknowledge that sin doesn't go away if it's not dealt with. It just hides and it waits. It waits for the right opportunity to pop up in life. And I know I've experienced this over the years, and you probably have too, where you said, I will never be like my parents. And then somewhere down the road, you're like, I'm exactly like my parents. You say something, you do something, and you feel it, right? It's passed on. You begin to realize what's going on. So there's a pastor named John Mark Comer. He's a pastor and author, and he dug into a lot of this. I read a lot of his kind of research into this, and he said something really heartbreaking but brilliant at the same time. He said, our children are born bent, but they're bent in a certain direction, and it's a direction that looks a lot like how we are bent. And so we pass things on to the next generation, just as the previous generations pass things on to us. And so there's a high probability that you struggle with a lot of the same things that your parents struggled with. And your kids will struggle with some of the same things that you struggle with if it's not dealt with. So let's go back to promises, because I know that got really dark. We made a real hard turn there, right? Well, let's get back and show you how this ties into God's promises. You might be thinking, let's just take it out. Let's come up for some air, right? Let's come up for some air because that's a really dark thing. Well, I think that the reason why I wanted us to go here is because I want us to take an honest look at ourselves and patterns of sin that might exist in us, because we not only inherit sin from Adam and Eve, but we inherit patterns of sin from our families really closely. It's something that the Bible supports. It's something that science is supporting. It's saying that we inherit patterns. We've seen it in families for years, where if somebody is an addict, their kids are more likely to be an addict as well. Things get passed on. Patterns get passed on. And so what do we do with them? Well, this is where God's promises come into play. Remember, his promises, they're bigger than us. They're bigger than our sin. And so we can bring these struggles to him. We can bring them to him, bring them into the light, and he will help us deal with them. So what I want to do is I want to jump forward into the book of Exodus. So where we're going to be in Exodus is actually, it's the place where Israel has been rescued out of Egypt. And now Moses is leading them. They've been through the desert. They go to a mountain. Moses is receiving all the law from God. And God proclaims his name to Moses at a certain point. And I want to read this passage to you, because this passage, that scholars believe this passage is the most alluded to or quoted verse in the Bible by the Bible, which means it's the most repeated thing in the Bible, okay? And I want to read what God says and does to Moses. It says this in Exodus 34, verse 6. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. So you can see why this is such a loved passage, right? Because it talks about God's mercy and God's grace and God's love and God's forgiveness. But there was probably a moment when I was reading it where all the warmth got sucked out of that verse, didn't it? Because God goes after the grandkids and the great-grandkids. And so you're probably thinking, what's up with that verse? Why would he do this? Well, I think it's worth kind of breaking this down. Because sometimes there's a gap a little bit between taking something that's in a Hebrew language and bringing it into English, because we don't have layers to some of the words like they do. Just like if we would translate anything from any language into English or back and forth, they have layers to things we don't have, or they have cultural expressions, and they have sayings to things that we don't have. And so sometimes we just miss what's happening. Now, let me give you an example of this. This is one of the funniest examples. I love this example. You may remember years ago that Pepsi came out with a slogan, and their slogan was, "Come alive, you're in the Pepsi generation." And the commercials are all about like hanging out during the summer and having picnics with people and opening a nice cold Pepsi and just enjoying yourself. Come alive, you're in the Pepsi generation. Well, when that slogan was taken into other markets overseas, it didn't always translate really well. And so in some local Chinese dialects, it says, "Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead." Fun example. Sometimes things don't translate very well, right? Okay, well, that's what's happening here. So the context of this passage, we have to look all the way around it. In fact, God says the complete opposite of this in this book and in other places. Even Moses says that in other places. And so it can't mean what it says it means in our English Bible. So what does it mean? Well, again, scholars will point to exactly what we've been talking about. This idea that consequence and weight of sin will be passed on to generations if it's not dealt with. It's not him bringing judgment to people who have not committed those sins, but rather he's saying consequences get passed down. Let me give you another example. And again, this is not to shame, but I think it's a common example that we can agree with. That when parents decide to separate and get a divorce, it has an impact on kids, especially in developmental years. And what it causes inside of kids of divorce, they can have trust issues, they can have insecurity, they can have fear of commitment as they grow into adults. And so something that their parents struggle with can have a great impact on their development and who they are as adults. I'll just say this, as an adult who went through that when I was a kid, my parents divorced when I was like 6 or 7, and it was a messy divorce. I am still learning about myself and still learning how that impacted me as a man and as a father and as a husband and even as a leader here in our church. I'll see things that'll come up out of that wound that I experience. And I'm surprised by it happening all these years later. And so it's something that is passed on. And again, it's not an example to shame anybody, but we just have to see that what we do, what we decide, it can be passed on to our kids. So let me get back to this passage, give a nice little clean bow on the end of this thing so we'll all feel better about this when we walk out of here, okay? There's a symmetry happening here. That when you read into commentaries and you look at what scholars have studied here, there's a symmetry happening with these numbers where God says to the third and fourth, but previously he said to thousands. And what he's contrasting here, he's contrasting the generations. He's almost giving this word picture because it's an idiom. It's something that has a deeper meaning, not a surface level thing. So if I were joking with you and I said, I'm just pulling your leg. I'm not gonna pull your leg, that's weird. It's just a word picture, but you know what it means. This is a word picture that God is using right here, where he's saying, I have justice that needs to be employed to the third and fourth, but I've got mercy that's waiting for you that's immeasurable. And he's giving an image here of one of those kind of old merchant scales where it's going back and forth on the balance, and he's saying there's no contest. There's no contest. Yes, you have inherited things from your parents that need to be dealt with, but my mercy is massive. My promises are reliable, and I promise that if you bring it to me, bring it to the light, I will heal you. I'll bring wholeness to you. I will take that generational sin that has been passed on, and I will break it in your life so that you can pass on something more beautiful to your children. You see that image that he's giving there? He's not saying that he's going to pass on the judgment of sin to the grandkids and the great-grandkids. He's saying, no, just look at the image, this word picture I'm giving you, to the third and fourth, or just this endless amount of mercy that I have for those who I love. See how big his promises are? He promises to give us mercy, to bring these things into light. Because God's promises are reliable, but they run so much deeper than our past. Whatever we bring into that relationship, he can heal it. Just like Abram, just like Isaac, just like all these fathers of the faith that we can look into their stories, and the Bible gives us a very raw and honest picture of who they were. It does not sugarcoat who they were. They struggled with some deep things. But just like those guys, your past may have shaped who you are, but it doesn't have to shape your future. Because God says, I have mercy that is immeasurable, and I can break that sin in your life. I can break that generational sin that has been passed on, that struggle that you've had. I can break that. Just bring it to me, because I have endless mercy. And we see this come true. Again, God is reliable. We see it come true because God does fulfill his promise. He does make Abraham a great nation. He does bless him and his family. He does give him a great name and great reputation. And he blesses the whole world through one of his descendants by that rescuer that was promised all the way back in the fall. That rescuer who's Jesus, who says, come to me and I will break that sin. I'll take it on myself so that you no longer have to carry it on and your kids no longer have to deal with it. I will break it for you. Just bring it to me. Bring it into the light. Whatever you're struggling with, bring it here. So do you really believe that? Like, you really believe that if there's a pattern of sin in your life that it can end? That this common struggle, this pattern that you always go to, that it can really be broken? It can, because God has promised us mercy. It's one of the most beautiful promises he has in all of the scriptures, and it's available to each and every one of us in endless amount, and that's the most beautiful thing. We just need to bring our sin and our brokenness to him and allow him to shed light on it and bring healing to us. Whatever you're struggling with, bring it. Let me pray for us. Father, we thank you for your endless mercy and how here in the Old Testament, this beautiful picture of giving us something that we don't deserve and withholding things that we do deserve, that's an image of your Son. That is Jesus dying on the cross for us, giving us a beautiful picture of how far you will go to rescue us and redeem us. So Lord, if there's anyone who is struggling with something that has been passed on, this pattern, a struggle, Lord, break it for them. We're thankful that that's a promise that is available to us. We're thankful for all the beautiful promises you have in your word. And we praise you, and it's in the name of our rescuer, Jesus, we praise you. Amen.